Right. Okay. Right. So morning, everybody. Welcome to Southampton Voluntary Services Friday Forum for February. This month, we have invited along Chris Walker from NCVO, who's going to talk to us about political activity and campaigning by charities and what the rules are, as well as a bit of reflection on some of the cases that have come up over the last couple of years. So the reason I've wanted to put this on is twofold, really. Firstly, we are obviously going to be going into a general election this year. And secondly, there's been numerous national policies which have proved quite unpopular with a lot of charities for various reasons. However, a lot of the time, boards of charities and leadership feel their hands are really tied about talking out about stuff. So what we want to do today is try to alleviate some of those myths, make you aware of a few tests that there's been over the last couple of years where the Charity Commission has intervened to make sure that everyone feels that they can have a voice around policy as we move through this year. So I'm not going to ask everyone to do introductions because I think we've got a few too many and we'll be here for ages. But when we come on to the questions part of the session, then maybe people could say what organisation they're from when they ask a question. So without further ado, Chris, welcome, and thanks ever so much for agreeing to come down to talk to us. So over to you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Robin, and no problem at all. Pleasure to join you this morning. I will just share my presentation.
Perfect.
So hopefully everyone can see that.
Yep.
Fantastic. So yeah, as Rob said, I'm Chris Walker. I'm Policy and Public Affairs Manager at NCVO. So I look after our relationships with politicians, particularly on the sort of parliamentary side. But I also do our policy around charity law regulation, and that includes campaigning. So I've been sort of working with these rules for a number of years now. So hopefully I've got a pretty good sense of where they are and what you need to do. So as well as going through, I think, some of the key points that we're keen to get across to people. And today, really happy to take questions and have some discussions about some of the issues in this area. So firstly, I think it's really important to kind of like know what it is that you're actually looking out for in election year. So the Electoral Commission guidance is really important. Now I'll start actually here by saying that very few charities will need to register with the Electoral Commission as a non-party campaigner, and I'll go into all sort of all the rules on that. But don't worry too much about that. And the purpose of doing things like today is just to make sure people are familiar with the rules, but kind of understand where they're likely to apply. Charity Commission guidance, I would say, probably is a bit more likely to be something that you'll have to think about, just because there is sort of, there's no threshold. If you get it wrong on the Charity Commission guidance, they can take action. They are also they take proportionate action when it comes to things like this as well. And then also, if you've sort of been involved with looking at the rules in previous years, there's just a couple of changes that just to be aware of. So lower thresholds, I'll come on to. Digital imprints, I've realised I don't think I do have something on this, so I'll mention that now. So you might be familiar with, so when you get sort of like a political party leaflet, on the bottom, it will have this very small print which sort of says the leaflet is paid for by X and printed by whoever. So this is basically sort of just transparency around who is paying for and who election material is on behalf of, and that regime is being extended to digital imprints, and it is also including it also includes non-party campaigners. Unless you are registered as a non-party campaigner, you shouldn't have to do too much on it. It's only if you do paid for ads on sort of campaign issues. I won't go too much into that because I think I would say it's just one of those things. If you do a paid for ad which is sort of political in nature or campaigning in nature, then look into the rules then. I should say as well, to accompany all of this, we are going to be publishing our own sort of guides on the things that you need to think about in the next couple of weeks, and there is actually a bit more information on digital imprints in that, so keep an eye out for that. We're trying to make it as accessible as possible, so fingers crossed we'll manage to do that. The really big message I want to give to people is we think you can campaign with confidence. There's a really important role for charities to play and the voluntary sector to play in talking about the issues that affect the people they support. The Charity Commission makes very clear that campaigning is a legitimate activity for charities, and I think they've actually been much more strong and robust on that in the last couple of years, despite some of the issues that Rob talked about and some of the challenges with that. So I think there's a real opportunity as we go into election for charities to campaign with confidence, to engage with political parties and try and make sure that the political agenda reflects the experiences of those that we work with, and that we have better policies coming to the end of it. So probably worth mentioning here, you may have seen some coverage last week of a Labour had a civil society summit where the most newsworthy thing was Keir Starmer talking about how the importance of national trust and RNLI were the particular examples he used of their campaigning. But also throughout that day, he talked about Labour, working in partnership with civil society, which is certainly what we want to see. We want to have strong working partnerships with all political parties, so we can make sure that our sector is informing what government does. But to do that, I think we've got to have that confidence that we can speak out. So on that point, to make sure we've got confidence is really important. We know how to manage the risks and we understand the law that we're applying. So I always think, it's much better and you're in a much better place to be campaigning if you know what it is that you've got to stay in line with. And the other, I think, main point I'd make here as well is I think charities can sometimes be quite risk averse when it comes to campaigning, and concerned about speaking out on certain issues. I think it is important that we do that, and I think it's absolutely right that charities should think about the risks and manage those appropriately. But I think it's also really important those conversations think about the risks of not doing something as well, the risk of not speaking out and what that might mean for the people that you're supporting. So I think the key messages on this are about understanding the rules, managing the risks appropriately, and considering all of the risks, not just the risks of doing something. So on that, I will now go into a bit more in terms of what the rules actually are and what you need to be following. So we'll start with the Electoral Commission because that's sort of what people do start turning to. Now I've put here Lobbying Act. This is the sort of shorthand for the 2014 legislation that regulates campaigning by non-party campaigners. It also regulates campaigning by other groups as well, but we're interested in non-party campaigners because that's where charities potentially can be classed if we do certain things. So regulated activity is essentially activity that meets all of the tests of the Electoral Commission, which means that you have to, that if you carry out a certain amount of it, you will have to register as a non-party campaigner. So the threshold for that is essentially £10,000 worth of activity. That includes staff costs. Yeah, probably worth saying here that I can't imagine anyone in this meeting will meet that threshold. Partly because that's quite a lot of money to spend on campaigning, but also a lot of what charities do, because it is in line with charity law, means it's quite unlikely, though not impossible, to meet all of the tests around the Lobbying Act. So the first test, and probably the key one in most situations, is the purpose test. So the purpose test is essentially that it's like a reasonable person test, basically. And a reasonable person, if a reasonable person would consider that the campaign material you've produced is intended to influence the way someone might vote in an election. That's not quite the words they use, but that's roughly what it's aimed at. Then you would meet the purpose test, and I'll give some examples later on of how a charity might manage to meet the purpose test. And then secondly, the material has to be made available to the public or a section of the public. So where this is quite helpful is it means that all of the sort of kind of engagement with candidates and parties behind the scenes, that is unlikely to be public. So you're not, that's not sort of what you're going to be considered, even if it potentially could meet the purpose test, if it was made available. The other thing, just to note, I think on the public test as well, is that press conferences are an activity that's regulated, but if you are sort of asked for a comment on a news story, then that is actually exempt from the public test. It doesn't count. So even if you respond, if you were asked by a newspaper to comment on a story, and that comment is something which otherwise would meet the purpose test, it still wouldn't be regulated activity, because it's exempt. And I think it's also important to note with the Lobbying Act that you don't have to, if you're not going to do that much in this area, you don't have to worry too much about whether you've technically met the purpose test or not, because the Electoral Commission rules don't stop you from carrying out that activity. They only regulate how much of it you can do before you have to register as a non-party campaigner, and as I said, that's £10,000 worth. And then the bit which I never even have to remember the number for, you can no longer do that if you meet the upper spending limit. The upper spending limit, I think, is a few £100,000. So no charity is getting near that, even kind of the national ones. So yeah, as I said, the threshold. So this is something that was introduced by the Elections Act of 2022. So previously, the threshold was £20,000, but it's now the registration threshold has been lowered to £10,000. So if you intend to spend £10,000 on regulated activity, you need to inform the Electoral Commission, and they'll put you on the register. As I say, can't imagine anyone here will meet that threshold, but the reason why you need to let them know when you intend to spend it is because once you have reached that threshold, you can't spend any more on regulated activity until you are on the register. So that's why you just need to let them know that you're going to submit that, and so they can do it in time, and you don't have a cap of spending. Again, I know that no one here will meet that threshold, but useful to know, maybe. And then if you then spend £20,000 in total on regulated activity in England, or 10,000 in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, you also need to meet reporting requirements. So this is where you will list all of the things that you've spent. You don't need to do that if you're between £10,000 and £20,000 and you're not spending 10,000 in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So that was the sort of compromise they came up with in including this lower threshold, is that we wouldn't have to have those reporting requirements on that lower threshold. So as I say, very much for information, and so kind of like, and also I think to give you reassurance that you don't need to worry too much about hitting those. Probably the area where smaller charities are most likely to get into the area where they might have to register is joint campaigning. So the Electoral Commission, and this is sort of based on the Act, will say where organisations work together to a joint plan, they are each responsible for the collective expenditure on regulated activity. So what that means is if you're part of let's say you're part of a coalition of 20 or 30 organisations, you've all sat down and you've said, we are going to carry out this campaign in the election. We're all going to do different things, and some of it is going to be regulated activity, things that we've paid for, and we know it. Let's say it's going to be £15,000 worth of regulated activity, so we know we're going to have to register. There are two different ways of dealing with that scenario. So I think, but the key point is, if the collective expenditure goes beyond £10,000, each member of that coalition or that joint campaigning plan is essentially responsible for that collective expenditure, that £15,000. Now, in terms of actually recording that, there's two ways to do it, and one is much easier than the other. So the much easier way to do it is you have one of those organisations will declare itself to be the lead campaigner on a campaign, and they basically register everyone's expenditure. So they will list who all of the I think they might be called other campaigners actually when you do that. The alternative, if you don't have a lead campaigner, is that every organisation that's part of that work and part of that plan will have to individually register, and they will all have to kind of like count. I said 15,000, so you wouldn't meet the reporting requirements, but you would certainly still have to register. So this is why I think if you are in that area and you do meet those criteria, you definitely want somebody to nominate themselves as a lead campaigner. Worth saying though that joint plan is quite a formal approach. So there are definitely ways that you can structure work, which means that you shouldn't meet that. So part of it might be, well, it's not regulated activity because you don't meet the purpose test. You kind of steered clear of that. But also there are things which the Electoral Commission has specifically set out are not considered joint plan. So, for example, signing up to a joint letter, which something that often happens in elections, on its own, that's not considered a joint plan. It actually has to be a serious plan of work. It's got to kind of say we intend to make this expenditure of regulated activity. Again, there's a bit more detail on that when we publish our guidance on that. So, but joint campaign, I will say, is it's the area that I think people find really challenging. It can be quite confusing, and the Electoral Commission have sort of said they're going to, they are happy to offer a bit of advice on that if people are getting involved in that. The other really key thing I think to think about in terms of the Lobbying Act and Electoral Commission rules is the regulated period. So regulated activity is only, it's only regulated activity if it falls within the regulated period. The regulated period is a year before a general election takes place, before polling day, and it applies retrospectively. So if it was the 2nd of February today, isn't it? So if it had happened to be polling day today, then the regulated period would have started on the 2nd of February 2023. And so any activity that had taken place in that period could be regulated activity if it meets the relevant tests. Now, what we've said previously, and I think we've got a pretty good understanding of the Electoral Commission on this, that's difficult for them to say explicitly, is that if you didn't know there was going to be an election, then even though you're in the regulated period, it's very difficult for you to meet the purpose test, because the purpose test requires that your intention is to sort of influence the way people vote. If you didn't know there's going to be an election, then how could that have been your intention? And that's the kind of argument I think we've run with. So what I would say, and the reason why I've got this this news story from last year about an autumn 2024 general election, is I think it's quite likely that because autumn has been the sort of this year has been the date that's been put around most for the last couple of years, I think it's quite likely that if you have had carried out regulated activity since October 2023, I think it's quite likely it would meet the purpose test, even if because I think there would be a reasonable expectation. However, I think if you did stuff in summer 2023 or May 2023, and we did happen to have an early general election and you were technically in the regulated period, I think it's unlikely that it would meet the purpose test. So just a bit of nuance around that one, really, and it is a slightly tricky one, and I think people do struggle with the regulated period a bit. But it's that is very much the rule, and it's there really so that people can't do lots of campaigning activity before the official campaign starts, and sort of max out all their spending limits. So there is a good reason why the regulated period is that long. But yeah. Now, probably what's going to be much more relevant to sort of the work that you're doing is what the Charity Commission say. So the really key things in relation to election. So firstly, charities can't be party political. So it's really kind of like watch out for that. There are some really like obvious basic things. So not explicitly supporting or opposing parties, not donating to parties or candidates. So I would say generally charities don't really have any problems with that. That's fairly straightforward. However, you also have to sort of not be seen to be party political, and that can be more challenging because perceptions can sort of vary depending on the activity you do. Yeah, so you can sometimes get caught, particularly when an issue sort of rises in prominence. So actually, I would say as we get into an election period, it's more likely to be a challenge that certain issues will become associated with political parties, and you might have to be quite careful about sort of the tone you use in communications and sort of how you campaign. So the Charity Commission has published a blog on this. It was a joint blog with the Electoral Commission. And that's essentially what they said, was, they reaffirmed that charities can campaign in elections, and it's an important opportunity to influence the way political parties and candidates approach issues, but that you would have to take care and the issues do become heightened in an election period, and so you're more likely to face a challenge on that. That might be something, perhaps when we have a discussion, that might be something we can talk about in terms of some of the examples that we've seen in the last couple of years. But I wanted to sort of like go through a few sort of probably slightly more basic examples from slightly longer ago. And also just to remind that you can't support or oppose. So this one is about supporting a candidate or a party. So in 2015, the Hindu temples, I think they issued a statement which essentially said, vote Conservative. I can't remember the exact wording. The Charity Commission said, well, you obviously can't do that. That's supporting a political party. So remind the trustees of their responsibilities, make sure they don't do that again. In 2017, they put out this statement. So it says, whether British Hindu voters vote for Prime Minister Theresa May, who performed Abhishek with Britain's Hindus, and whose parties elevated Indian origin parliamentarians to cabinet and ministerial positions, or whether they vote for Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn, who snubbed Prime Minister Modi's parliamentary address and whose grandees are determined to foist caste labels upon British Hindus, it is critical that British Hindus do vote. So I don't think anyone is confusing that for a sort of neutral message. It's like very clear what they thinking behind that. And the Charity Commission did say again, no, yeah, you can't do that because there's a clear perception that you are favouring the Conservatives. So just by way of an example, I should say that one is relatively straightforward. Sometimes it can be a bit more challenging in terms of working out what kind of crosses the line and what doesn't. But then also really important to remember that you can't oppose candidates or parties either, except in sort of very limited circumstances when a party is just so opposed to your charitable purpose that it's not compatible. So this is I think a more interesting one actually. So UKIP. I forget which election it was actually. They in their sort of manifesto they had pictures they used from Gladstone's library. So Gladstone's library is a sort of charity associated with the works of William Gladstone, and they a candidate I think sort of implied that UKIP that the charity supported UKIP. So the charity they made a statement. They disassociated themselves from support of any political party. Made clear that they weren't a political party. However, they also use this phrase, which is the policies and principles on which UKIP is based are far from the ideals of William Gladstone. So the problem with that is then I think reasonably interpreted as opposition to UKIP, and they couldn't really be opposed either. So although they'd sort of done the right thing in many ways of coming out and not being associated with UKIP, they went too far. And they kind of made a statement, and the Charity Commission talked to them, and they changed their statements. They've now just got a factual statement, I think, if you look at that. So just a kind of thing about an example about being aware of where that's going to come up. I think it's really important to talk about what you can do. So charities absolutely can campaign for particular policies. I should say, by the way, this is very much not an exhaustive list of what charities can do in campaigning. It's just the main things that tend to come up. So charities absolutely can be involved in what the Charity Commission call political campaigning. That's campaigning to essentially influence policy. And they often do, and you'll see all sorts of charity campaigns based on sort of these policy issues. You can also comment on and criticise party policy proposals. So here, where there tends to be kind of question mark is how you might react. I think in an election, I think in particular, it's worth sort of thinking about how you do that. So to take a sort of more straightforward example, if you've been campaigning for a policy and one of the parties says this policy is in our manifesto, is going to be in our manifesto, then you absolutely can welcome that and welcome that support. Equally, if a party is clearly announced a policy which is clearly opposed to what you've suggested should happen, that you can criticise as well. That's absolutely fine too. The question here will always be around the extent to which you're perceived as being party political. So it's if your criticisms or support are based on policy, they're based on evidence, they're constructive, you'll generally always be okay. But it can get more challenging, and I think certainly if we look where I think this has been a real challenge in the last few years has been when charities have wanted to issue quite robust criticism of party policies. So I would say Rwanda policy has been heavily criticised by immigration charities, migration charities. And there is a danger that if you have a really kind of strong line on that, that could be interpreted as being, anti-Conservative Party. So I think you need to think about how you talk about that issue. But I should say, on the other hand, as well, there is a danger, and I think one of the, we generally welcomed a lot of what Orlando Fraser has said as chair of the Charity Commission, but where he has talked about this idea of sort of respect and tolerance in our statements, some migration charities might feel that it's actually really difficult for them to, certainly they won't, they can avoid personal attacks and things like that, but if they are, if their criticism is not seen as robust or weak, or it's seen as weak by their supporters, that actually could cost them credibility on the issues they speak on. So there is that kind of challenge of, like, you've got to have something which which is true to your charitable purposes and what you do, as well as trying to be respectful, which I think we'd always want to be as charities. So I think there's a really challenging grey area that's kind of emerged in recent years, and I think there's a few interesting examples that perhaps we can talk about in the discussion. The third point here is around engaging with parties and candidates. So this is actually often quite a low risk activity because it's not public facing. So working with parties, working with candidates, as long as you're kind of reasonably balanced, you work across parties, that's not going to be seen as being party political, because it's all and if it's connected with achieving your charitable purpose as well. And again, just to reminder, lobbying act doesn't stop you from doing anything. It just limits how much you can spend on certain activity. So message here is actually there's quite a wide scope for involvement in campaigning by charities and speaking out on policy issues, but with that caveat that you do just need to think about how this might be perceived or interpreted. So I mentioned when I talked about the purpose test, I mentioned that it's quite difficult to do something which meets the purpose test but is also in line with charity law. I would say that the really most obvious example of where this happens is pledges. So you may see this from time to time that charities, and particularly national charities, will put certain pledges to parties or candidates of things they want them to support, and then they'll sort of gather these pledges. So that in itself is fine. It's fine from a charity law perspective. It's fine from an electoral law perspective. But the way the Charity Commission and Electoral Commission will deal with it slightly differently might be in how you publicise it. So let's say a charity, it's got this pledge that various parties and candidates have signed up to. Let's say parties, because that's just a little bit more straightforward. So we've got this. So that's what could. We won't do this, but for example, if NCVO said we want the Minister for Civil Society to move from DCMS into the Cabinet Office, because we think the Cabinet Office is a better place for them to be central to government policy making. As I say, there certainly won't be a pledge. It might be something we ask for, but we get Labour and the Lib Dems have signed up to it, and the Conservatives have opposed it. They said we're actually not going to do that. We think DCMS is the right place for that. We then publish that information. We say, really pleased, that Labour and Lib Dems fund, or even just factually, let's say Labour and Lib Dems have signed up, Conservatives haven't. Charity Commission would, I think, say, yeah, that's fine, because you have really you've set out essentially what is an objective criteria. Do these parties support this particular policy we're pushing for or not? There's no sense that we are partisan in putting that forward. It's just a straight factual statement of who supports this particular policy, and there may well be other things that we do where there'd be different types of. It might be the Conservatives that support and Labour that oppose. The Electoral Commission would say that by comparing the policies, and it's a policy that you are supporting and advocating for, you are essentially it would be seen by a reasonable person to be intended to influence the way people vote, because you're saying, well, we support this, so you would vote this way. So it's quite an interesting one in that there would be that sort of divergence. So I hope that does make sense about as an example of where charity law and electoral law might not line up, and you can have these slight sort of anomalies. But again, happy to get that into the discussion if that doesn't quite make sense for you. Few thoughts on engaging with politicians. As I sort of mentioned, different approaches are fine as long as you engage across parties. So for most local charities, I imagine when it comes to engaging with parliamentary candidates, it might be that you engage with a range of councillors from different parties. But you probably, when it comes to Westminster, you probably are just engaging with the MP. And you're not thinking too much about, well, who's going to be the candidate. I think an election campaign itself, you probably do want to talk to the main candidates, even if it's quite a safe seat. I think it's useful just to kind of sort of expand that. They may also as well be local councils or otherwise involved in the local community. But I think everyone would expect that you are going to focus on the candidate who is most likely to be the MP. And I think that's fine, or the two candidates maybe. And equally at national level, that's kind of what we'll do. I think there's been, over the last 15 years, a lot of focus on engaging with the Conservatives as they've been in power and kind of always looked likely to be in power at each of those elections. And there's been engagement with Labour, because I think it's very important. They have a really important role, both in opposition, but as a potential future government as well. And what you have seen, I would say, in the last year or so, is a lot of charities sort of flipping that slightly, spending more time on engaging with Labour because they look more likely to form the next government. So it's that sort of thing, which is absolutely fine. It's in line with charity law, and it is as long as you have good reasons for doing it and they are related to achieving your charitable purpose. It doesn't have to be you do exactly the same for each party. That's really the point I'm trying to make there. If you decide to do hustings, or you try to arrange hustings, really important that you have objective criteria around who is invited. I'd say though, for a local hustings, I'd probably lean towards inviting more, because I think it's quite hard to justify if you've got a constituency hustings not inviting like all of the candidates really, unless it just gets really unwieldy. I think let's say if you've got maybe 6 candidates, I think that feels to me like it should you probably invite all 6. And so if you're doing something on a regional or national level, then you probably do then have to kind of like limit how many parties, but you would do that through sort of levels of support they might have. You might think about, you might say, well, we'll only have parties that have that already have incumbent MPs. You can do it that way. My assumption is that if we did a national voluntary sector hustings at the moment, we would probably say that we'd so obviously Conservatives and Labour we would invite, and then I think just based on the polls, I think we'd probably have to invite Lib Dems, Reform, and the Greens, because that's kind of the really clear one. And then you could like look, well, do we need to go further than that? The other question that we might have is, well, should we invite SNP MPs? Sorry, SNP representative? Should we invite a Plaid Cymru representative? I think one of the things we would probably, you can make a criterion in that case is saying parties that could, technically form a government. So that's, and so for NCVO, it's not too much of a problem for us in terms of SNP and Plankery, because we represent English charities. Whereas I think if we were an organisation that was a membership organisation for the whole of the UK, that might change our view on it. It might make it, well, actually, maybe we should invite. So essentially, you need to do this thinking about who is included, and you have to take an objective approach to it. It can't just be like, well, let's fiddle with this so that it can be the people that I want in there. And as I said, I think just generally engaging with candidates is really good practice, and it's also, as I said, quite low risk. So worth doing in the lead up to election. And I would say, if you're not already, you should definitely be keeping an eye out on who is standing in the constituency, in the constituencies that you're interested in, and try to meet them early. One other thing to sort of bear in mind is political activity by staff and volunteers. So staff and volunteers absolutely can be candidates and politically active, but you'll need to think about what it means for your organisation, and particularly the Commission is really keen to make sure that staff and trustees don't use charities as a vehicle for their own political views. So firstly, I think there'll be things like thinking about what does their social media profile look like. Also, some organisations where people have quite prominent candidates might say, well, we will now make sure this person is not involved in we don't use an external spokesperson because we think that kind of blurs the boundaries a bit. NCVO, we have just introduced a new political activity policy, and we have and it's slightly stricter for certain types, say very senior staff, but also people like me who work regularly with politicians. It's more important that I'm seen to be politically neutral than somebody who is working on our practical support work. So it's just that kind of understanding where the sensitivities are in the organizations. And I think the most important thing is that there were just open conversations about this, that staff consider between each other, but also the board are involved as well, and you've thought about what it is you need to do. So I think that's something I would say if you've got people who are interested in standard candidates being active. So I just wanted to sort of finish with a few top tips in terms of following the law, and then I'm really happy to sort of open it up to questions. So, as I've said, I think engaging with a broad range of parties and candidates is a really important thing. So this actually is the hustings that we did alongside Charities Aid Foundation for the last election. And you can see there, it's very similar to sort of the scenario I outlined just now, where we had obviously Brexit instead of reform, but otherwise those kind of like four main parties. I think what I try to do with this is make sure that people are aware of the rules, they understand the kind of key points, but then don't worry too much about. So I think I tend to talk about it. You don't have to check every tweet. It's over compliance is a problem in itself, and if you can kind of say, look, actually, as a charity, most of what we do, we're not going to meet unlikely we're going to meet the purpose test. Maybe it's possible occasionally we might do. We're not going to spend lots of money. We don't have loads of staff costs going towards this. So in reality, we need to do something quite big to get us to that threshold. So we're not going to just check every small thing that goes out and really kind of think really carefully, well, does this meet the purpose test? So it's about having a really sort of proportionate approach, and not spending loads of time just tying yourself up in knots because you're really worried about about what happens. But I also think to do that, you kind of do have to have a decent understanding of the rules. So the thing I would say is it's worth kind of having sessions like this, going along some webinars that various people will be doing, and just like making sure you're pretty confident about sort of where those boundaries are. Focusing on your key messages. So if you kind of do if you're doing sort of your normal campaigning, your normal activity, very unlikely to cause you any problems. It's when you're drawn into issues that are a little bit outside your comfort zone, that you don't have that same history, that you might get into slightly more trouble. Being strategic about how you intervene is always important, and thinking about, well, actually, what is it that we're trying to achieve? Is this the best way of trying to do that? Is there another opportunity potentially which might be better, might be lower risk? Yeah, so this is an interesting one, I think. So making sure people know what is expected of them. And I think this is in relation to, well, the example I've used is an example that came up sort of fairly recently. So this is Alistair Strathern, who was the Labour candidate in the Mid-Bedfordshire by-election, eventually won it. During the campaign, he did a visit to like a local park run. He did a video of himself at the park run, and then he sort of like published a campaign video. At the end, it had the sort of the vote Alistair, thing. There's his strapline across whatever he was doing. Park run then contacted the Charity Commission to sort of say, "Oh, is this okay? That could people like associate with this?" And the Charity Commission said, "Well, you should make sure that it isn't associated. He's not associated with you as a charity, and that candidates know." Now, I personally think that in this case it was probably okay, because I do think I'm slightly worried about this idea that if particularly when you have the kind of standard campaign graphics, that if you kind of like say to candidates, well, you can't just put that at the end of your video, because then it's political. And charities can't do it. Well, I think candidates start to say, well, actually, do I visit a charity? Because that's quite awkward for us to have to do something totally different. So I'm a little bit worried about that specific thing. But the general principle is right, that you need to avoid candidates being associated with your charity in that way. So it's worth reminding. It can be worth, if you haven't if you engage with candidates, you might want to remind them that they need to be a little bit careful about that they don't imply that you are supporting them as a candidate. And also in this category as well, I would say making sure volunteers know like what they need to do and how they need to approach these issues as well. And then making sure everyone is on board is really important. So there's a couple of examples of this recently, and I will talk about the RSPB one here, because I think this is quite an interesting one. So the RSPB made like quite a controversial intervention in terms of campaigning, in that they so this was in relation to government have repeatedly promised to uphold environmental protections post-Brexit. And I forget exactly what the announcement was, but in response to this, RSPB put out a tweet which said, I think it was Rishi Sunak, Michael Gove, and Therese Coffey are liars. And then they kind of like did a thread about kind of why this was the case. So they a couple of things happened. Obviously, the Charity Commission were interested in this because there was a real danger of that being seen as as an anti-conservative approach rather than just based on policy. So certainly a danger of that perception of them being seen as anti-conservative. If you look back at Actually, I won't get into that. So there was that risk. What also happened is that the board raised concerns, and I think one member of the board who is associated with the Conservative Party publicly sort of said, actually, I didn't approve this, and I don't think we should do things like this. So there was an apology. The tweet wasn't deleted, but there was an apology. Sorry, this is quite a complicated one, but I know it's one it's useful to cover. And I apologise particularly for personalising it and suggesting that they should instead focus on the issue rather than making it personal. As far as I'm aware, the Charity Commission may still give a bit of a ruling on this and say what they think about the approach that was taken. But I certainly think that if you're going to make this kind of really controversial intervention, it's really important to get that buy-in from the organisation. So making sure the chief executive is on board, making sure that the board are supportive as well, because then you do just get these like really difficult situations where you might get that opposition. Sorry, Rob, that took me a bit longer than I was expecting, to be honest, but I know we've got plenty of time. I hope that's okay. And I should say, I'm happy to answer questions now, but also I've got my details up there and I can share the slides as well. I'm really happy to answer if anyone does have any questions on this that come up sort of later in the campaign. So do get in touch. But I will stop sharing and yeah, very happy to have any discussion that people might want.
Right, brilliant, Chris. Thanks ever so much. So I'm going to stop the recording now. But just to say, if you are watching this after the event, or to our viewers at home, do get in contact with us at Southampton Voluntary Services about our monthly Friday forum, and also do look out for future guidance from NCVO around political campaigning and political activity by charities. Chris, when's that likely to be published?
If everything goes to plan, week after next.
Right, perfect. So do keep a lookout for that. And just to say, it's today is the 2nd of February. Right, I'm going to stop the recording now. So thank you ever so much, Chris.